Hello again. And so we begin with our connection between Mendel and modern genetics. A lot of the work that Mendel did provided the foundation for our study of modern genetics, but since Gregor Mendel, in the last 150 years, we have expanded on everything that Mendel has given us to start with and created a very, very thorough understanding of how genetics and reproduction and the passing on of traits and genes actually works. And we've discovered many things that Mendel really had no idea about. But of course, none of that would have been possible without the foundation that he laid simply by growing pea plants in his garden and keeping track of all the different possibilities. So, of course, what we're really talking about here is reproduction. And so what we need to do first is just take a quick review, and this video will just be about what reproduction is all about and how it actually works. There's basically two types of reproduction, but before we get into that, what is reproduction? Well, all living things have to reproduce. If you can't reproduce yourself, then you can't carry on. And so being able to make a copy of yourself and reproduce yourself is a critically important part of life progressing and moving through many centuries or millennia, as we've seen over the history of the earth. Now, I said all living things must reproduce, but the concept of reproducing is actually older than living things. Reproducing simply means making a copy of yourself. And so there are molecules. Molecules can make copies of themselves. I should say some molecules. We're not talking about molecules like carbon dioxide or anything like that, but some very important molecules have developed the ability to copy themselves. And so if you can copy yourself, even if you become destroyed or taken apart or disassembled, then this copy can carry on. And so because you can copy yourself, what a copy basically means is that information survives. Information about you survives even after you're gone. And so the very first molecules that play a role in our reproduction were these molecules that had this ability to copy themselves. And one of these kinds of molecules belongs to a class of molecules called nucleic acids. Nucleic means found in the nucleus, and acid is a kind of molecule that has a certain chemical nature. When we think of acids, we often think of very powerful acids that burn off your skin, and we see them in the movies, and we hear of murderers trying to dissolve bodies in acid. But in biology and chemistry, an acid is a huge class of molecules. And essentially, many of the molecules that work in our biology are acids, even though they don't exhibit the same sort of corrosive and destructive properties. So, for instance, vitamin C is an acid. Vinegar is an acid. And believe it or not, these chemicals that live inside the nucleus of our cells are also acids. But don't think of them as acids in the corrosive sense. Think of that as just a class of molecules to describe them. There's basically two types of nucleic acids. There's one called ribonucleic, all one word, acids, which we conveniently shorten to RNA, and deoxyribo. Whoops, I guess I better go back and respell that. Got ahead of myself. deoxyribo, and again, getting ahead of myself, it's two words. That's all one word, and then acid. Deoxyribonucleic, all one word. And these big words simply refer to the kinds of chemicals that are found within the acid molecule. Bigger molecules are made of smaller molecules, and so these are relatively big molecules that are made of 2 or 3 different smaller molecules, right? So this is called DNA for short, and we've heard of that. That's what's in our genes. So where does this come from? Well, the ribo part refers to a molecule called ribose, which is very simply a type of sugar. It's a sugar molecule. There are many types of sugar. The sugar that you eat most often is called sucrose. That's what's on your table. And you might have heard of the sugar that's in your bloodstream, glucose. But this one is ribose. You'll notice all these sugars end with O's. That's a family sort of surname for all the sugar molecules. And there are many. There is the sugar that's found in milk that some people cannot digest properly. Lactose, if you're lactose intolerant, right? Ose. So there's many types of sugars. And ribose is just one of the many types of sugar molecules. And if you take a course in organic chemistry down the road, you'll see just how big this field is and how many different molecules there are, and how our common everyday use is only a small, tiny fraction of all the possible molecules that exist. So there's a molecule called ribose, which looks like a sugar. And we're not going to get into too much detail just yet in terms of all the atomic structures. We'll do that in a different video. Right now we're just trying to talk about reproduction and how it works. So these nucleic acids are the information carriers. Because they can reproduce themselves, right? They can make copies of themselves, then the information they carry can be carried on even after these acids are long gone. They leave behind copies. Now, that means that cells can use these molecules, the DNA in particular, or the RNA in some cases, to store and copy information to be passed on after the cell dies. Okay, that's essentially what reproduction is. So, reproduction comes in 2 major types. One is called asexual, which means without sex, and then the other one is called sexual. Now, we have to also make a small definition here. What we mean by sex. Sex is not what we think. As human beings, we think about sex as the act of a man and a woman getting together and doing whatever they do in the privacy of their own bedroom. That is part of sex. That's actually called copulation in biological terms. But sex is much bigger than that. That's just one of the many ways to actually have sex. And when you start to look at all the different plants and animals out there, you will see that there are several different ways that Mother Nature has come up with in order to have sex. Flowers have sex, people have sex, but not nearly in the same way. What sex is about biologically is it's about sharing or combining genetic information. That DNA has to be somehow shared or combined. And there are many ways to do it. And we'll look at some of those ways. So, asexual reproduction is not sharing any genetic information. That's the key. Whereas sexual reproduction is you are sharing information, which means you're getting different combinations all the time. Okay, so let's talk about asexual reproduction briefly. There are many ways that things can reproduce asexually. The most simplest way is something called binary fission, which is essentially splitting in two. Splitting in two. And of course, cells do this all the time. Cells do this. Bacteria cells, the cells in your body, they do this. And of course, we have a special name for the process. It's called mitosis. And you learned about that in grade 10. And we also touched on it a little bit at the beginning of this year. Mitosis, the process of cell division. It's how two cells are produced from one cell. And if you recall, in the phases of cell division, we have the initial phase. We have the growth phase of cells, which basically is what we call the G1 phase, where cells are growing. Then we have this special sort of special phase, which I think is sometimes called the S phase. And then we have another growth phase, G2, and then we have the mitosis part, right? And the mitosis is divided up into prophase, metaphase, you'll remember all these words, anaphase, and telophase. So from grade 10. The S phase is somewhat important because that's the phase where you get the copying of DNA happening inside a cell. Now, how the DNA copies itself is quite a complex process, and you will learn the details of that chemistry in grade 12 biology. But for now, we just have to understand that the DNA can somehow copy itself. So I'm not going to go into a total review of mitosis. That's kind of expected that you all understand how that works and what's going on in each of these phases. However, just to remind you, I have attached here I've looked up some pictures. That's not the one I want. Go back here, mitosis. So here's a picture. If I click on this, we can see this. Well, maybe it was the picture I had before. We can see here what's going on. And it's important to realize what's going on in each phase. The first picture is sort of the prior to mitosis, and then we have the second picture, which is prophase. The third picture is later prophase. The fourth picture is metaphase. And then the fifth and sixth pictures are anaphase, and the last two pictures. Well, the last picture is the final two cells divided. The previous one is telophase. It says that in the descriptions underneath. And of course, you can see what's happening. The chromosomes have been copied. The chromosomes are the cell structures that contain the DNA. So the DNA is copied. The cell structures are then lined up in the cell, these chromosomes, and they're pulled to either end of the cell, and the cell divides. So you get a copy in each of the cells, and we get that. So that's called binary fission, and the process is called mitosis, and most cells can do this. Almost every cell. In fact, if you can't do this, then you can't survive. You have to be able to divide in order to live. There are some things that can actually reproduce without being a cell. Since we're talking about viruses right now, the coronavirus is rampant, and the way a virus reproduces is kind of interesting because it does actually reproduce its DNA. Let me move this up. When we talk about a virus, which is sort of on the weird borderline between living and not living, a virus isn't a cell. It doesn't have all the parts that a cell has. It's essentially a coat made of some protein molecule, and inside it has the DNA molecules. So it's a very simple structure. And without ribosomes and mitochondria and an endoplasmic reticulum and all of the other things, it has a very hard time reproducing on its own. In fact, it cannot. So what the virus does is it infects an already developed cell. It lands on the cell, it penetrates the membrane, and it squirts its DNA into the cell. This is virus DNA. And so what happens is then this virus DNA, remember DNA is instructions. This virus DNA takes over the cell by masking the cell's ordinary instructions from its own DNA. And the virus DNA gives the cell instructions to build more virus DNA, to construct molecules. And then that virus DNA becomes basically new viruses. The cell is hijacked, and all of the normal cell processes stop, and the cell devotes its time now to following these new instructions to make virus. And then the cell explodes because it's full of virus, and it spreads these new viruses everywhere, which then go on to infect more cells. So the virus is not technically alive because it can't reproduce on its own, but it does utilize DNA, and some viruses have RNA inside them, but it does utilize nucleic acids. So it's kind of like an in-between sort of state that has evolved alongside of cells, that's dependent upon cells. All right. Other kinds of asexual reproduction, besides mitosis and binary fission. Well, mitosis could occur inside a larger animal that's bigger than a simple cell. Then one of the most common is an animal called the hydra. And it looks like a little, it's got all these little tentacles, and it has a base. And the base tends to sort of attach to something, and it kind of sits there. It has a very primitive digestive system. It has a mouth sort of right inside here, and it wiggles these tentacles around, and bits of stuff that are in the water float in here and go into this mouth area, and that's how it gets its nourishment. But when it's time to reproduce, the cells in a certain spot will undergo mitosis at a rapid rate, and they will grow a little blob as the cells divide. And then the blob will then become sort of almost like a little baby hydra growing out of the side, and then eventually it'll break off completely and it'll grow into a whole new hydra. Let me show you some real pictures of that on the internet. Let's go back here. Let's see. Budding. Here is a picture or a graphical sort of representation of it. Not sure if that's going to give me a... There we go. So a tiny bump appears, and then the bud grows into a little baby, which breaks off. Now what's interesting about this is these cells have just divided more rapidly, and they are exactly the same cells as the parent. So there is no exchanging of genetic information with another hydra. This hydra simply just grows a baby out of its own cells. So it's asexual because there's no exchange of information. Another thing that can happen is the plant, like a strawberry plant, for instance. I have an example of that here. You'll see this strawberry plant in this picture is growing these little, if you look on the top right, these little red stems, they look like, and they are extending out. They're called runners. So they are grown from the parent plant, and they're basically mitosis, cells developing rapidly and growing, and they reach out from the plant across the soil. But then what happens is wherever they touch the soil, a little tiny root system grows out of them. And a new little plant, you can see the tinier plants that are growing sort of on the edges and in the middle of these runners, are growing. Let me go back to the other picture, which kind of shows whoops, I missed it, sorry. There's a picture here. Here, this is the one. If you look at this picture in the top right, it shows the runner coming out. And then these little daughter plants are growing beside the parent plant. Now, what's interesting is these runners formed simply by growing off of the parent. So these baby daughter plants are exactly the same genetic sort of information as the parent. Again, asexual reproduction. And there are lots of other little ways that this can happen, but the key is to remember that there has been no interaction with another plant or another organism. That's the key. Now, sexual reproduction evolves, and we have seen in some of the life cycles of molds and funguses, and in the conifers, we have seen sort of how sexual reproduction has begun, right? How there's a division into what we call the sperm and the egg cell. These two cells develop and then are released out into the atmosphere, it could be the atmosphere, I guess. If you're a pine tree, you release your pollen into the air, out into the water. What I meant to say is out into the environment. These are somehow released into the environment, and then they're allowed to interact. And the key thing, of course, is that you have one particular individual making the sperm. So this is one set of DNA information. But this other one is a completely different DNA. And when they combine, they will now join, and information from two individuals becomes blended into one. So the idea is that later, a sperm and an egg will join, and when they do, they form a new cell called a zygote. And we've seen that word before in our life cycles. The zygote, which is now a combination. And you'll also recall that the sperm and the egg, imagine if you wanted to combine two different books. Well, if you took two different books and you smushed them together, and then that book was then smushed with another book, after all this smushing several times over, you'd have an extremely large book. It would make no sense because it would have bits and pieces of every other book smushed into it. And so you can't just keep combining cells. What you have to do is you have to separate the DNA. And so what you need is you need a sperm and an egg cell to have half of the genetic information. So remember the diploid and haploid number. Haploid. So sperms and eggs have to be made special. Mitosis won't work. They have to be made with N, the haploid number of chromosomes, or half the genetic information, so that when they recombine, you get back to the diploid number. So the first problem of sexual reproduction is figuring out a way to divide up your information. And of course, that process is meiosis. And we have seen how meiosis works. It's essentially a double division. And it works because chromosomes in cells exist as homologous pairs. All of this should come back to you. And the homologous pairs can be separated. So what meiosis does is it separates the homologous pairs first in the first division. Right? Now remember what homologous pairs means. It's chromosomes who have the same job, but are slightly different. All right? So imagine in a city you have two firemen. They both put out fires and they both do the same job, but they look a little different. They both might perform that job a little differently, not exactly the same. So you can have the same job, but you can still be slightly different. And of course, this is what Gregor Mendel was stumbling upon in his research, and we're going to see how that fits into modern genetics too. Homologous pairs are separated first. So in the first meiosis division, homologous pairs are separated. Homologous pairs are separated. And then in the second division, the actual copies that were made, copies of chromosomes, are then separated. And we've seen this before, so I'm going through this pretty fast. And of course, you can also get a really good description of this online if you want to review it. You can go to Wikipedia, you can go to just about any website that describes meiosis and get a very detailed review if you're still a little fuzzy on that. And so the end product of meiosis is either a sperm cell or an egg cell. Now, as we've seen, there are some plants that produce both sperm and egg. A conifer pine tree produces male cones and female cones, and it produces both sperm and egg, which it then sends out it sends the sperm out as pollen, and then the pollen eventually lands on the egg cells of another pine tree. But there's also the idea of, instead of having both sperm and egg produced by one individual, you could have two different individuals, male and female. There's a big fancy name for this. It's called sexual dimorphism, which is a big fancy way of saying boys look different than girls, right? If you look at a pine tree, you can't say that's a boy pine tree and that's a girl pine tree. They're all the same. They both contain male and female parts, right? The antheridium, remember the antheridium was the male part, and the archegonium is the female part, right? So you have all of that on the same tree. But when you look at humans, we have a different strategy. We have actual different individuals who only produce sperm or only produce eggs. So that's kind of an interesting thing, and there are lots of different variations. Most animals have sexual dimorphism, but not all. There are some where you cannot tell the difference between a male and a female, like the earthworm. The earthworm actually has both parts and produces both. So it's kind of an interesting, there's a whole other field of study that you could get into there. Anyway, the idea is the same, though. We need to have sperm and egg that are formed. And then, of course, you have to get the sperm and egg together. So getting the sperm and egg together is what we're actually more inclined to think of when we think about sex. This is the part that you think about. It's the part that humans focus on. But really, the main part of sex is the making of the sperm and egg, and it's the meiosis that happens. And of course, I should remind you that in our bodies, this meiosis process only happens in a very special organ. It happens in the ovaries or the testes, right? No other organ can do this. Liver cells do not undergo meiosis. They don't. They undergo mitosis. So this is a special system for a special process for getting the sperm and the egg together. Okay, sexual dimorphism and how we get things together. There are lots of strategies, and we talked about the conifers spreading their pollen into the wind or into the water. We talked about different animals, fish, the female fish. There's a female fish. She lays her eggs in a little rocky spot on the ground. Then the male fish comes along after the female fish has already deposited the eggs, and the male fish then deposits sperm on top of them in an external fertilization. But that's kind of risky. Some animals have developed an internal fertilization, like humans, where sperm is deposited directly inside the female's body. So she doesn't lay eggs, she keeps the eggs inside, the internal fertilization occurs, and she nurtures and grows that egg in a uterus or a womb, and actually then gives birth to a live baby. So that's a slightly different approach, but it's the same idea. There are lots of strategies. Flowers have sexual reproduction, where the pollen is accumulated on the bodies of pollinators like bees, which then fly to another flower and deliver that pollen to other flowers. So in a sense, bees are the way that flowers have sex. They rely on an entirely different organism to help them out, which is very strange. It's kind of a symbiotic relationship. All right, so now what we have to do in our next video is look at this sperm in this egg and this DNA inside, and how it all sort of fits in with what Mendel was talking about. Because Mendel knew that when you produce a sperm and an egg, you have a mom and a dad. And he knew that somehow this mom and this dad contributed things called factors. He didn't know what they were, but he knew there was something. And somehow these factors got together, but he was able to determine that they got together in different ways. And he saw that there was the idea of dominance, incomplete dominance, complete dominance. There was co-dominance, and all the different things that we studied. And what we need to do now is figure out how these things actually take place. What's really going on inside cells? We need to get into the nitty-gritty and study this DNA in more detail and figure out the secrets of the cell and how it does all the things that Mendel said it does, without just, imagining factors. And of course, we know nowadays that the term for factors is a gene. That's what a factor is. But we need to understand in a sort of a more basic way what a gene is. So our next video will focus on DNA and genes, and it'll be a little bit more molecular. We're going to look at atoms and molecules and how they make up these things. So there's just a quick review of basically reproduction in general and all the different ways it can happen. And I was going back there to the start because the main difference that we want to understand is these two things: asexual and sexual, and the idea that sexual reproduction, which we wrote way up here, is making copies and information that can survive, right? I guess I wrote it down here. Anyway, you get the idea. So sexual reproduction versus asexual reproduction. Meiosis and mitosis. And you really need to understand that fundamental difference before you go further, because you have to be able to learn the foundational basics. You have to know these things cold. If you're foggy about mitosis, look it up. Go on the internet and remember it. If you're foggy about meiosis, look it up and remember it, because these are the basics that you need to understand the more complicated things as you move on in biology. Most of you are taking bio because you have a plan that bio will be part of your future. So you got to know all these